Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Changing Game Dev Life, a podcast where we interview folks working in the game industry and ask how they got there and who helped them along the way. We focus on interviewing people who may break the historical mold of who is in games.
This podcast is for anyone who's interested in the soft and squishy human parts of getting into games work and how to make it better.
I'm Pejman. I'm a professor at Ontario Tech University. I study games and user experience.
And I'm Jen Whitson. I'm a professor, sociologist at the University of Waterloo's Game Institute. And I mostly work with game devs and aspiring devs to understand who gets to make games as a career and why people leave it. And today our guest is Dr. Johanna Weststar, who's a prof in the Department of Management and Organization Studies at Western University in London, Canada. And I wanted to have Johanna here to talk today because she's awesome, but she also represents somebody working in and around games who has a really different expertise than game making, right? They're not a designer, they're not a developer, and as far as I know, they are not an artist. They had a really different education path, and their work looks really different. But I'm actually really sure you probably heard of Johanna's work. She's been behind the IGDA developer satisfaction surveys for more than a decade. So if you've heard about things about how many women are in the industry or how many hours of crunch is expected, those mostly come out of some of the surveys and studies that Johanna has run. So she produces all of those sexy stats that have to do with things like quality of life in games. You can check out some of these at their project website, gameqol.org, gameqol.org. Johanna is also an expert on labor relations and unionization. And so you may have heard of her on NPR or at GDC or seen her work covered online on layoffs and unionization in games specifically. So inquiring minds want to know, Johanna, what does your work actually look like? What do you do on a day-to-day basis that relates to games?
For sure. I have to probably disclose that my spouse does make games. So I do have a small insider knowledge person speaking behind my shoulder. And despite all my good advice, he's switched over from interactive media and now makes VR games. But it is nice to have someone right near you to be a sounding board sometimes. But yeah, my work in the game industry doesn't look like game development at all. I do play some games myself, but they're probably not very exciting ones by grand standards. And I spend most of my time interviewing people who work in the game industry, so game developers of all types, and also engaging in survey work for people who work in the game industry. So as Jen mentioned, this work with the International Game Developers Association, the IGDA, right now it's every 2 years survey. And each year as the survey approaches, we have to kind of have a look at it, make sure that all the questions still makes sense, see if there are any questions that we want to change. So for instance, when we did the 2021 developer satisfaction survey, of course, we were in the middle of a global pandemic. So we kind of said, maybe we should ask some questions about that of people who work in the game industry. So we came up with some new questions for that. This year, we had some information from the Game Credits Special Interest Group. So they're a body that is sort of a volunteer group under the IGDA. And they wondered if we could ask some new questions about game crediting, which we hadn't done in the past. So we thought, yeah, okay, we can do that. The one complicating thing about that survey is it's quite large, but also it's been now translated in 7 languages, which is amazing. But I do not speak any languages except the one I'm speaking right now. So that was a challenge. And in the early days, we kind of, by the seat of our pants, got some of those translations done. But in this last round, we actually, through the IGDA, partnered with a studio called LokeQuest, and they did proper translations for us because they're a game translation company. And that was a really great experience because the survey's better for it. But I also got to meet a bunch of people who worked in translation and asked them to fill out the survey as well, because that's another area of game making that I think is sometimes quite underlooked. Folks that do translation and localization work, etc. So that was kind of a neat experience. That's what my work in games looks like, is out there talking to people and learning about their experiences, and then trying to translate that into information that's useful. So I'll be upfront, right? As an academic, in order to keep my job, I need to produce a certain number of academic articles on a certain basis. And so that's part of it. But as an academic, sometimes you can feel a little bit lonely in that you write papers and you work really hard to see these super smart things, and no one reads them outside of a small population of folks. Part of my focus in all of this has always been, how can we also get this information back in the hands of people who are actually going to do something with it? And that's ultimately the folks in the community, right? The people who are doing this work all the time. And so partnering with the IGDA is really part of that, because they play a very practical translation role in connecting with the industry. And more lately, I've had some contact with some of the unions who are interested in organizing in the industry, and they're really interested in data, because the industry is quite secretive and there isn't a lot of data out on a number of these things, and data sort of comes and goes sometimes. So when we can create some good data for good benchmarking over time, it's nice to get it back to the people that can use it.
That's amazing. And I'm so glad that you accepted our invitation to join us today. And thank you so much for doing such an important and influential work. I wanted to ask you, maybe let's go back a little bit, maybe 10, 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get interested in this? What's your story? How did you get started?
Yeah, I was doing a PhD in industrial relations at the University of Toronto. And I was kind of looking around for something to do my PhD about. And I ended up doing a thesis around workplace learning and worker autonomy and control, and whether people who had more autonomy or control in their jobs, if they were better able to utilize all of their skills and capabilities fully. It was part of sort of a larger project, and I was assigned the IT piece. So I was sent out very green into IBM Studios, actually, which was just north of Toronto and Markham. And I had to go and interview all of these super techie people about their jobs and their learning. And as I was doing that, I was like, oh, studying the tech industry is kind of neat. And I was really, and this is, not a negative statement to any of my colleagues, but I was surrounded by people in a field who were studying very traditional industries, especially if you think about it from a labor perspective. Well, what are the industries that are unionized the most? So people are doing a lot of work on the public sector. People are doing a lot of work on things like manufacturing, primary industry kind of industries, also some in service, but in the hospitality area of service, there was nothing going on about tech. So it felt kind of interesting there. And then the real catalyst, and maybe the listeners out there have heard about this, but in 2004, a person, a then unidentified person, wrote a blog on LiveJournal. It was one of the earliest blogs that ever existed. And they wrote it under the name EA Spouse. And EA Spouse was the spouse of a person who worked at Electronic Arts. And it was a scathing account of the working conditions at Electronic Arts, like just did not pull a single punch. And this thing went viral and everyone was talking about it. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I was too far into my own thesis to switch gears at that point and just drop everything and start studying the game industry. But I thought, this is a place I could go. And my thesis supervisor always said, you need to find a niche, right? You need to find something that's going to make you unique out there in the world, especially if you're not a superstar statistician or something like that. And I was not a superstar statistician. So I needed to find a niche. And I thought this could be it. And so after I finished my PhD, then I transitioned over and started making connections to say, I'm going to study labor in the games industry, such as it was. And that was the story.
So why the game? What about that article or the industry that attracted you? I'm very curious. As a player, you were interested to know more about the industry, or any other factor impacted that decision or that desire to study game industry?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like any, whether an academic is like a failed journalist or the other way around, anytime you come across something that's like a juicy scoop, it's very interesting, right? So here I was spending all my days learning about labor, learning about workplaces, learning about laws, learning about unions, and everybody in the field is saying unions are dead and this is over and it's doom and gloom. And I was just like, what the heck am I doing in this industry, in this field anyway? And then to really see at a grassroots level, what then, after I started looking into it more, was really the case of an industry that was just desperate for the workers to start pushing back and to start acting. And the industry itself had a lot of really unique features, like the fact that it's completely project based, has a lot of implications for how it's structured and how that changes the work that people do. All the things I was learning in my human resource management classes about a traditional operations based company didn't make sense in this company. And so it just was very, very exciting to think that I could look into an industry using all of these tools that I was learning, but in a way that was almost more hypothetical. Like, well, what would work in this industry? And if these people were to unionize, how would they even do that? What would that even look like? Because there was just nothing there. And so I think that's what was really exciting. And of course, you're way cooler when you can stand up in front of undergrad students and say that you research the video game industry. Then you get a bit of street cred, which I think is useful. And I didn't otherwise feel like I had that street cred.
Point of fact, I would like to state for the record that Johanna is a really big nerd in terms of tabletop games and things
That's
like
true.
that. So I think there is an affinity there with game developers that you're sort of hiding.
That's fair. That's fair. They have much swankier conferences than we do, which Jen can attest to as well. You feel like much more of a rock star. But yeah, for sure. The content is interesting. And it's amazing, even though I obviously could not program my way around a game whatsoever, and I'm not an artist by any means. But yeah, the medium itself is very cool, and the people working in the industry are very clever and interesting, and having sort of an inside behind the curtain look at what goes on behind a lot of these big titles is kind of neat too.
I want to pick that up because you noted that the game industry can be quite secretive and that there isn't a lot of data generated on things relating to industrial relations and labor and employment. Yet it seems like you have inside access to studios, right? You've interviewed people on live service teams. You're doing the DSS survey. You sort of rub shoulders with a lot of folk in the industry. So what is the magic? How did you get access to these studios when other people seem to not get access? What was your secret?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And in some ways, the access is around the edge. So yes, I did do a study with a colleague, Louis-Etienne Dubois at Ryerson, about live service games. And we actually were allowed into a studio to interview some specific teams there. In all frankness, that was his connection and not mine. And like many things in life, it is a who you know story. So he had a connection of somebody in the studio who then was able to pitch our access. But in that way, I think when you are doing research with any partner, there needs to be a sense of what's in it for everybody. And so if you're an academic and you think that you just want to go out there and get data and strip it out of a place and use it for your own benefit, that's not a very good footing for creating a good relationship. So it really was taking the time to have meetings with folks in the studio, talk about what they might need, we gave a couple talks about other things to people in the studio just to show our value a little bit more. And that helped to create that relationship. Not to mention, we did have to sign non-disclosure agreements and all of that kind of thing and assure a certain degree of confidentiality, especially when you're in a studio, like you're walking around inside. you can see a lot of things that they might not want folks to see yet. If you're walking by a computer and someone's working on a new game or something, that's not something that you can talk about. So that's important in that relationship. All of my other projects, I have not operated through the employer, I'll say, through the studio itself. With the IGDA, because they are a not-for-profit industry association or professional association, they have an arm's length relationship, so to speak, with the industry. And so that way it's less about getting permission from studios. Again, there though, to keep that relationship going. And one of the things that's been interesting about that experience is that there have now been, I think, 5 executive directors of the IGDA over the course of the time that I've been working on the developer satisfaction survey. So each time there's a new executive director, then I need to send an email and be like, hi, I'm this person, and do my song and dance and convince them again of the value of the data. And different executive directors have a different focus, a different preference for different things. So again, it's about showing the value and having it be an actual partnership. Because most of the time, if I were to go to a studio and say, hey, could I talk to your game developers about whether they'd like to join a union or not? I'm not sure that they'd be like, yeah, come on in here. So we've had to do quite a bit of data collection that's just word of mouth or posting on social media or gathering folks at conferences and all of these other ways where you approach the workers directly as workers, not through their organization.
I'm curious, now that you've been involved in the DSS for over a decade, right?
Yeah. 2009 was the first one I did. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is 15 years now, almost. And sort of looking back, I'm curious as to whether there was some sexy stat that you felt had the biggest impact, and sort of what kind of impact can stats about the workplace have? That's my first question about the DSS. And the second is, now that you've been doing this for 15 years, how has the industry changed over time? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Are there just new problems where some are resolving, or what's happening from the big scale of things?
Yeah, I don't know if like sexy and stat tend to hang together in a
in my
sentence
world
all the time, but bless your heart, right? That's why we're doing what we're doing. Yeah, well, man, there's so much information in that survey. And I think a couple of interesting things. Well, one is maybe a funny story that for a number of years, we had a question in the survey, which was, which studio do you want to work for? And people could just write in anything they wanted. And for a couple of years, a couple of rounds, the IGDA was like, oh, we're really interested in that data. We want to put that data out. And I was like, of all the things we asked people in this survey, the one thing that you want to really run with in the press is which studio came out on top. So that was always kind of a funny experience for me. And it was often the same set, although a lot of people said that they just wanted to form their own studio and do wonderful things on their own. So that's good. The stats that I think I'm most excited about are ones that we wouldn't maybe have thought that we could ask all the time. And so we were able to get some questions into one of the early DSS versions, and then it sort of fell out for a bit and then came back. But these are questions around how workers feel about how useful their employers' systems are at resolving problems at work. And I always found those to be quite interesting. And there were also a set of questions around sort of kind of basic knowledge. How well do you know labor laws in your area? How well do you know some of these key elements? And I always find in this survey, it's the number of people who pick don't know as an option that I find to be very, very interesting and sometimes the most relevant, because people agreeing and not agreeing on stuff is fine. But in this industry, we ask a lot of questions around what kind of benefits do you have? Does your employer offer maternity leave? Does your employer have policies on retaining diverse applicants? Do you know the labor laws where you live? And large percentages to this day of people will say, I don't know. I have no idea whether we have any of these things that we might think are actually very structurally normative in other industries. And I think that's really illuminating that there is a lot that is still very informal, very ad hoc, not very transparent in the industry, that workers just don't really know how stuff works. They don't really know how people get assigned to projects. They don't really know how you might get credited on a game. They don't know if their company has a policy or not. And we keep seeing that level of, I don't really know, across all the years. And that's important because there's a lot to running a good workplace that is just transparency and fair procedure. And this industry is really still kind of wild, wild west on procedure.
I know Jen asked a second part to that question about the changes, but I wanted to maybe interrupt here quickly. I'm very curious to know, why is that? Do you think, is it because maybe at universities we don't educate people well to know about their rights? Is it because I've heard a lot that they say game industry is a passion industry? So is that because of that? I don't know if in your research, do you have any insight on why is this the case that people don't know those information?
Yeah, I don't know that I could give the expert definitive opinion or answer, but I can give my opinion on it. One is that, of course, the industry still is relatively young. It's aging. It is aging. But the average is still 35-ish. So that's still quite young. And what that means is that you have a lot of people coming into the industry who don't have very much other work experience. So they've not been exposed to other places that might do things differently. They've definitely not been exposed to any unionized environments, which would have a much greater level of awareness, at least around procedure and rules, because workers have to be more engaged in knowing about their collective agreement. And they also then wouldn't have had very many older workers in the industry to kind of educate down about what's going on, or this is how we do things or not. And also because there's so much mobility in the industry, and studios are coming and going and workers are coming and going. So many things get recreated again and again and again. And I think that also acts against process and against procedure. Bureaucracy is not something that is embraced in this industry, right? The project-based ethos, the whole kind of counterculture of the tech industry is very anti-bureaucracy. We want to streamline. We want to be nimble. We want to be flexible. We want to be fast. All of that works against procedure and process as well. And so that informality culturally is a stumbling block. And workers themselves, whether they agree with it or they've come to internalize it, but that is the culture, that is the environment that they're in. And so they may also feel, well, if things are too structured or if there are too many rules, then we can't do what we have to do. But some of that arbitrary, or in this book that I have coming out, we talk a lot about discretionary decision making. There is a lot of discretionary decision making in the game industry, and it produces these systems of inequity. It produces potential for this overwork or, not knowing where the limits are, et cetera, because there are no rules. So a lot of those things, I think, collapse in to kind of create an environment that is a bit loose in that regard.
This is the obvious point to say, tell us more about the book, Johanna.
So as we've noted, I've been working, in this industry for some 15 years now, but for the most part, I haven't been doing it alone. So I've been working most of the time with a collaborator in Montreal from TELUC, which is the Tele-University of Quebec. And her name is Marie-Josée Legault. And she and I did a lot of interviews with game developers back in 2013-14. And she did a bunch of interviews herself before we teamed up in 2008. And then she worked with me on some of the IGDA projects as well. She's the catalyst. I want that on the record. She was the catalyst to write this book because she said to me, I'm retiring and I want to write a book before I retire. And we have more data on this industry than anyone can do anything with. So let's get to it and let's put it all down. So that's how it happened. And the book is called Not All Fun and Games, and it's about citizenship at work. And so citizenship at work is a bit of a labor relations term. People maybe are more used to hearing something called industrial citizenship. Don't confuse this with citizenship behaviors from a psychology perspective. So if there are folks out there who are used to IO psychology and talking about organizational citizenship behaviors, where it's like workers going above and beyond what they have to do to help out at the industry, this is not that. citizenship at work or industrial citizenship is about the degree to which workers have a voice or a say in how their workplace or their industry is governed, and whether they have an ability to participate in the structures that can protect them in their industry. So there are 4 key pillars of industrial citizenship and being able to protect yourself against employment risks. And one of the elements of citizenship at work is having a union to represent and make collective your voice, but it's not the only dimension. And so what this book does is it sort of uses all sorts of qualitative data from interviews and all sorts of data from the DSS survey to put together an analysis of whether in a contemporary workplace like games, and we feel that the book can generalize a little bit to other project-based workplaces, at least in the creative or entertainment sector, do workers actually have the same kind of voice, the same ability to influence their workplaces as workers used to have in the 1950s, 1960s? Or have we seen an erosion in a lot of those basic pillars? And we conclude that there's been an erosion, and there's definitely a gap in terms of the ability of your contemporary worker to actually influence their workplace in a way that's going to improve their systems and structures. Maybe that leads to the what's changing question, but
Yeah, I was actually gonna bring that up, but yeah, I'm very curious to know that both in terms of trends and what's changing, but also I want to know what we could do collectively to make things better. Like, we imagine that our audience, our listener would be people from the game industry as our main audience. So what could we do to make things better?
Yeah, I mean, dialogue is always good, and it's a good place to start. And I think that that's what we've seen over the years. You know, if we look at from 2004 with the EA Spouse expose, a lot more people are talking about game developers as workers than they ever were before. And now in the field of game studies, there's a subfield called game production studies, where it actually is kind of taking head on the idea, well, let's look at this from a labor perspective. So the more we do that, the more we collect data and we sort of apply our knowledge about other workplaces to this workplace, the better. But for workers themselves, in some ways, workers always resist. There's always evidence everywhere of workers who are engaged in resistance, whether it's big or it's little, whether it's individual or collective. It is there because workers are human beings, and human beings, if they don't like something, are going to push back against it. The easiest, most visible sign of resistance is that you just quit your job and you find another job. And we see that all over the place in this industry and in others. If we kind of hone in on that idea, leaving a job doesn't improve the job for others. And it doesn't mean that you're going to go to a job that is better for you either. It might be equally bad, or it might be worse, this other job that you're going to. So exit, as we call it in industrial relations, is a response, but it's not a very developmental response. Voice, so if we think about being a citizen in your workplace and having a voice, is actually where change comes from. And voice can happen organically. It can happen informally. So workers being able to speak up in lots of different ways, just in meetings, just having conversations with a boss. It doesn't always need to be formalized. Workers can get together and just bring collectively a concern forward, and maybe the concern gets dealt with, right? That's a form of voice. That's a form of resistance. That brings change on an individual level in a studio. But if you ramp that up and up and up, then the voice leads to something bigger in terms of the collective. And everybody knows that a collective voice is more powerful than an individual voice. It's easier to say no to an individual than it is to 20 individuals or 400 individuals. And so the idea behind unionization or unions in workplaces is just concentrating that voice up, and all of those individuals then are speaking together and calling for sort of the same kind of change, but also giving it some legal teeth. So there are, as I said before, lots of ways that workers can speak up in their workplace, but the employer can always say, well, thanks, those were interesting words, goodbye, and that's that. They have no obligation to listen to the worker if they don't want to. We could argue that it's often in their best interest because workers are the ones doing the job and they have lots of good insights about how to make the work better, but the employer doesn't have to listen. But when you are a part of a legal entity called a trade union, they do have to listen. They're obligated by law to listen. They're obligated to sit down and actually negotiate the terms and conditions of work. And so that is actually one of the few ways that workers can make real, direct, and sometimes very fast change in their workplaces, because as soon as you change a practice or a policy, it can flow out very, very quickly. You can change laws and things like that, but they're a lot harder to do, right? You've got to lobby the government. You got to get people on side. So unions are actually much, much more efficient at localizing voice into a workplace and empowering that group of workers to make change to solve their immediate problems. And what's amazing right now, and it's super exciting for me as an academic where life tends to move very slowly. And when I came into this field, it was like, I don't know, would this ever happen? And now it's happening, and it's happening fast. So since some 2018, there have been rapid developments on the unionization front in this industry, starting from grassroots movements that then attracted the attention of labor unions that, frankly, I think weren't paying attention before, maybe didn't understand this industry and how big it was. And they sort of woke up and went, holy cow, this group of workers is here and they're ready. They don't really know how to do any of this stuff. And the workers themselves would say that. They're like, we have no experience with unions. We don't know anything about this. But they're keen, especially certain groups are very, very keen. And now we do see large, very institutionalized unions getting involved and actually also changing a bit their own approach in this interface that they're creating with these new workers, because these workers are new to the labor movement as well, and they've got kind of a different style. And so unions are having to kind of respond to that too. So it's quite an exciting and interesting change, because we're going to see more protections for workers, which invariably are going to lead to better conditions. I mean, are unions going to end crunch in the industry? No, probably not. Are unions going to mean that there are never layoffs again in the industry? No. Like nobody would have that expectation. Maybe some people would, but this is a completely unreasonable expectation. But they will change things at the margins in a lot of different places. And they also will get renewed as a result of having all these new, young, tech-savvy folks in their ranks. So I think it's going to be kind of a real growing experience on both sides. And I mean, I'm super keen to see like what some of these first collective agreements are going to look like, because that's going to tell us a lot about how unions, how those workers in those organizations are able to kind of sustain their momentum and convert their energy right now into rules on paper.
I like the way that you frame this as exit versus voice. To go back to the sexy stat that I always think of is just how many people fight to get into games work and then leave within 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Which is a huge percentage. How many people are actually exiting? And that leads into other stats that you find about the perpetual youth of the industry, that they're super young, they don't have families, because as soon as they get older and want to do other things as well with their life, like buy a house or have kids or things like that, they just move out of the industry entirely. To me, it's really interesting that we have this built-in metric for the health of the industry, as is the average age of workers, right? It is an unhealthy industry if your work average age is super young, because it means that people are entering and burning out and leaving super quickly. And the older our average age gets, the better built-in mechanism there must be for actually retaining and providing a more sustainable career, which is super interesting to me to see that built into these what seem like really simple statistics. I'm curious as to what resources you would recommend or that you felt were really helpful in developing voice, right? And supporting people for developing this voice rather than just exiting the industry.
Yeah, that's a big money question, because there is, I mean, think of like we all have jobs, right? Think about, what does it take for you to speak up, right? What does it take for you to speak up in your job ever, or on a day-to-day basis, what does it take for you to go to your supervisor or your boss and say, no, this isn't right. Or no, even on an individual level, no, I'm not going to sign that contract because I don't agree with your NDA policy, or I don't agree with your non-compete policy. That's probably a better example, right? Or no, this isn't enough money for me. I want more, right? It takes a lot out of a person to say, oh, could you pay me a little bit more? So in a way, it's a big ask voice. And some people are just a little bit more out there on that front than others. That's always going to be the case. But I think what you need to develop at the grassroots level as you start bringing this into workplaces is the safety of it. And one of the things, so Game Workers Unite is this grassroots body that really sort of catalyzed the unionization movement in the industry. And they were very focused on bringing workers together, providing them with information, educating them, and focusing on one-on-one conversations. And if you look at the literature around organizing workers, it comes back to this idea of nothing beats a face-to-face conversation with your coworker. And there are all sorts of programs now it's part of the union renewal movement. It's part of this idea that we need to get back to the workers. We need to go back to mobilizing. We need to go back to having one-on-one conversations. And these train people to talk about issues in the workplace. So that's number one. It's not a secret. It's not a secret what salary I'm making or what you're making, or that I got Friday off and you didn't, right? All of these different things that have been like, well, side deals and all this discretionary decision making, and no one talked about it. And it's just like, I don't know, you just got a job there. I don't know what happened. None of that needs to be a secret. And if we actually start sharing that information about our own experiences, then we learn that we have things in common. And we also learn that people have been able to get things that we haven't been able to get. And that's all very useful, right? Because that starts building this collective consciousness of, we are here. These things are happening to us. We're not alone. And we see that there are sort of ways that you can maneuver here around getting a better deal, or whoa, I didn't even know that a better deal that even existed. Oh, now I do. So I think that's where you start, right? And that then builds awareness. It builds confidence. It builds safety, but it needs to be protected until it's kind of big enough. It's like it's a little precarious little organism at first, a group of workers that are coming together. And it does have to be sheltered and protected because there's danger out there. There are sharp things out there. And employers, sometimes more than others, sometimes are great, sometimes they're not great, can really attack that burgeoning little voice. And so it's important to protect and have workers feel that they can have those conversations with each other in a safe place. And then you just kind of start small, right? And you develop this instinct for activity where, all right, we've identified problems. Now let's try a thing, right? Let's try a little action. Let's see how that goes. Let's see how that goes. And then that can kind of build. And unions are really good at this, right? They've been doing this since the 1800s, right? They know the rule book. They've had to reinvent themselves too, but they know how to protect workers. They know how to talk to workers and sort of galvanize them towards that common goal. And it takes a bit of leadership. So it's usually nice in a workplace if some kind of, we call them natural leaders, if some natural leaders emerge and people are willing to trust them and have confidence in them and follow them, that helps. But it really is just kind of each person at a time and figuring out what they're interested in, what their needs are, and building that sense of collectivity. And then that's what can kind of leverage you towards having that stronger, bigger voice.
Johanna, it give me so much hope just listening to you. It's so inspiring the way you explain this. I have two questions. So group of our audience going to be students hoping to get into this industry. So I'm very curious to see what sort of advice you may have for them. And also what sort of advice you may have for those people who are going to hire our students. So the people going to be their first bosses, the first supervisors. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, Jen knows we're working on this one project with students, and we ask them a question of like, what advice do you have to recent graduates? And it's always interesting what they say. I think it's important, and some of this is what the students say, is it's okay if games isn't it for you. I mean, that could apply to any industry, right? When you've got your heart set on something and then it doesn't look quite right, to sort of think that you need to go and do something different is a hard choice. But I think this industry is always going to have unique attributes. And there is just going to be a certain level of tolerance for how this place is structured. I think there's just going to be, at base level, a higher level of precarity in this industry, probably than a more bureaucratic job. That's just the way it is, right? You're working in arts and entertainment. That's life. And that there are cycles to the work, right? There are going to be slower times and faster times. I think that's okay, but I think that what I would say to students is that they should really know it well. They should take the time, and whether that's talking to people who currently work in the industry, whether that's reading stuff about the industry, go into it with your eyes open, right? Know what it's going to be and think about whether that's the kind of environment that feels okay for you, and not just maybe for right now, but maybe also for later. And this is where it's hard, when we're young, we have hard time thinking about when we're going to be old and when we have other things happening in our lives. But right now, you don't age gracefully in this industry. So that is something for folks to think about. Maybe they have to think about themselves as a major league basketball player or something, and like your career is this long and then you need an exit strategy. I don't know. That's probably less optimistic than saying, just go into it with your eyes open, learn everything you can about this industry, and think about whether its rhythms are going to fit with you. Because you could make games as a hobby and have another job, and that might still be fulfilling if that's what you're passionate about, as opposed to choosing this as your full-time career. And if it is your full-time career, then that's fabulous, right? That's amazing. And congratulations on that choice. But stay aware and get connected with your community. And I think there's a lot to improve in this industry. And I would just sort of encourage them to try to be part of the improvement, I suppose. The other question I forgot.
For the supervisor, the first supervisor, first process.
I forgot because that one's harder. I don't think this is just for games. I think this is for any boss ever. Don't be afraid of your employees. Don't be afraid of your workers. You hired them. You had to have liked them at some point in time. Talk to them. You'll learn things and they'll learn things, and it's okay to be transparent about what you're doing. So I think that's the first thing. And for heaven's sake, if your workers do join a union, it is not a personal insult to you as a human. Most of the time. Maybe sometimes it is. But generally, it's not just about you, right? And there are really, really, really wonderful collaborative things that can come from working with your employees on rules and processes and procedures in the workplace. And you can have all sorts of great partnerships, but you need to approach it in that way. If you approach your workers as some sort of enemy to be feared, if you approach a unionization effort as this is going to be the end, you're not setting yourself up very well, right? A union does not want to crush your company. That's foolishness. They need you to survive, right? In that way, a union is like a little parasite or something that is in a symbiotic relationship with you. And so you have to treat it that way, right? And that really can build a lot of good stuff, is actually embracing that as a partnership. There, that's what I would say. Accept your parasites.
I love it.
That's my next book. I didn't plan to say that at the beginning.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love that advice. I am so glad that you were able to join us today and drop such pearls of wisdom. I can't wait for the book to be out and to use it in my teaching. For sure.
Oh, so nice, Jen. Thank you. And so nice to meet you, Pejman. And thanks, guys, for inviting me. This is an excellent project.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. Yeah, as I said, it gives me some hope for the future. And I'm looking forward to actually maybe meet you in person at some point. Like we are all kind of very close to each other in terms of like geographical locations. So yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
You can check out our website at www.changinggamedevlife.com for summary notes, a full transcript, and related resources that are mentioned in this episode. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our Substack page or follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. We're very passionate about having these conversations with people who make the game industry better. Together, we can drive positive changes. If this episode resonated with you, make sure to share the podcast with your network and take a moment to rate us on whatever platform you use. Thank you.